The evening was calm, the kind of night where the hum of the city settled into a quiet rhythm. Streetlights flickered against the pavement, and the occasional car rolled past, its headlights carving streaks of light into the darkness. She had just finished dinner with friends and was walking toward her car, her mind preoccupied with the usual thoughts of the day. Work deadlines, weekend plans, maybe even a text she had forgotten to reply to. As she reached into her bag for her keys, she noticed the police car approaching. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the parked cars, but she didn't think much of it. Not until she heard the voice behind her. "Ma'am, hands where we can see them." She turned around slowly, her eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Two officers stood there, their hands hovering near their holsters. The tension in their stance was unmistakable. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. One officer, a stocky man with a hardened expression, stepped forward. "We need you to turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." Her heart rate picked up. This wasn't a routine stop. This wasn't a traffic violation. They were treating her like a suspect. "What's going on?" she demanded. The second officer, younger but just as rigid, glanced at his partner before answering. "We have reason to believe you match the description of a suspect involved in a crime earlier tonight." She let out a breath, half disbelief, half frustration. "A suspect? What crime?" Neither officer answered immediately. Instead, the first officer reached for his radio, muttering something she couldn't make out. "This is a mistake," she said firmly. "I just left a restaurant down the street. I can show you the receipt. I can call my friends. They'll confirm where I was." Her words bounced off them like raindrops on stone. The older officer moved behind her. She tensed as she felt the cold metal of the cuffs snap around her wrists. "Hey," she protested, twisting slightly. "This is wrong." "Ma'am, we need you to cooperate," the younger officer said, his voice rehearsed, detached. "Cooperate? Cooperate with what? Being arrested for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Her pulse pounded as they started patting her down. Right there on the sidewalk, in full view of the few pedestrians still lingering nearby. A couple had stopped to watch, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Someone was recording. "Good, let them see this." "You're making a mistake," she repeated, her voice rising now. "Do you even know who I am?" The older officer scoffed. "Everyone says that." She clenched her jaw, inhaling deeply, forcing herself to stay calm. The last thing she needed was for them to twist her frustration into an excuse to escalate this further. Then she remembered her phone. Even with her hands cuffed, she could still ask them to make a call. "Fine," she said, meeting their eyes. "Then let me make my one phone call." The older officer chuckled. "You think a phone call is going to get you out of this?" A slow smile spread across her face. "Oh, absolutely." The air felt heavier now, thick with frustration and disbelief. Her wrists ached from the too tight handcuffs, but that was the least of her concerns. She stood beside the squad car, her breath steady, but her mind racing. No matter what she said, they wouldn't listen. Pedestrians slowed as they passed, some whispering among themselves, others pulling out their phones to record. She could feel their eyes on her, their silent judgment and curiosity blending into the city's background noise. She knew exactly how this looked. Another black woman being taken into custody, her protests falling on deaf ears. "This is a mistake," she repeated, but the officers barely acknowledged her words. The younger one leaned against the car, arms crossed. "Ma'am, we've already explained the situation. You matched the description of a suspect involved in a theft earlier tonight. We need you to cooperate." She let out a sharp laugh, unable to hold it in. "A theft? Are you serious? What exactly am I accused of stealing?" The older officer shifted uncomfortably, as if suddenly realizing they hadn't given her any specifics. "We'll go over the details at the station." Of course. Keep her in the dark. Keep her off balance. It was a tactic as old as time. "Listen," she said, voice controlled but firm. "I don't know who you think I am, but I can prove where I was tonight. I have receipts. I have witnesses. You don't need to do this." The younger officer sighed, glancing at the onlookers. "Ma'am, if you have nothing to hide, then you can clear this all up at the station." She shook her head, exhaling through her nose. And how many people have been told that, only to spend hours, days, locked up for something they didn't do? The officers exchanged a glance. They didn't have an answer for that. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. She could feel the rage simmering just beneath the surface, but she knew better than to let it boil over. They were waiting for that, waiting for an excuse to justify this, to escalate it. She took a deep breath and spoke again, this time slower. This time slower. I need to make a phone call. The older officer smirked, shaking his head. You'll get your phone call at the station. No, she said sharply. I need to make a call now. Something in her tone made him hesitate. There was an edge there, something certain, unshaken. The younger officer frowned, watching her closely. Who do you need to call? She lifted her chin, her expression unreadable. My sister. The smirk returned. And what's your sister gonna do? A small, knowing smile formed on her lips. Change your entire night. The officers exchanged another glance, this one laced with uncertainty. The younger one finally sighed. Fine. One call. They uncuffed one hand and held out her phone. She dialed quickly, the number committed to memory. As the line rang, she watched the officers, knowing everything was about to shift. When the voice on the other end answered, she spoke clearly, making sure every syllable carried weight. Hey, sis, I need you to talk to these officers. They think I'm someone I'm not. There was silence. Then the voice on the other end responded. Put them on. The officers hesitated, exchanging a quick, uncertain glance. The older one, clearly the one in charge, folded his arms, unimpressed. We don't take orders over the phone, he said. She ignored him, holding the phone up with her free hand. You might want to reconsider. The younger officer sighed, clearly irritated but also curious. Who exactly am I speaking to? My sister, she said, keeping her voice even. The U.S. Attorney General. The moment the words left her mouth, the air shifted. The older officer's smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered, forcing out a dismissive chuckle. The younger officer, however, stiffened, his posture less confident than before. Right, the older officer said, rolling his eyes. And I'm the president. Her expression didn't change. Put her on speaker. The younger officer hesitated before taking the phone and pressing the speaker button. Ma'am, this is... The voice on the other end cut him off. It was calm, but there was something sharp beneath the surface, an authority that didn't need to be stated outright. This is the U.S. Attorney General. Who am I speaking to? A pause, a shift in breath. The older officer's smirk disappeared completely. Ma'am. The younger officer's voice cracked slightly as he fumbled for words. I asked for your name, officer. There was another pause, longer this time. The street noise seemed to fade, swallowed by the weight of the moment. The small crowd of bystanders was still watching, their phones still recording. The older officer cleared his throat and stepped forward, motioning for the phone. The younger one hesitated before handing it over. This is Sergeant Mitchell, the older officer finally said, his tone noticeably more measured. Sergeant Mitchell, the voice on the phone responded. You are currently detaining my sister. On what charge? Sergeant Mitchell exhaled, shifting on his feet. She matches the description of a suspect in a recent theft. Do you have any evidence beyond a vague description? Mitchell swallowed, glancing at his partner. We're planning to take her in for questioning. Silence. Then the voice came back, colder this time. Let me be very clear, Sergeant. You are unlawfully detaining a U.S. citizen without probable cause. My sister is not a suspect. She is not going anywhere with you. You are going to release her immediately. The muscles in Mitchell's jaw flexed. He glanced around, likely realizing that the cameras were still rolling, that this situation had already spun far beyond his control. The younger officer looked like he wanted to disappear. Mitchell cleared his throat. We were just following protocol, ma'am. Then consider this a lesson in learning the law you swore to uphold, the voice replied. Release her, now. A long silence stretched between them before Mitchell exhaled sharply and pulled the keys from his belt. Without another word, he stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. The second the metal clinked open, she rolled her wrists, letting the circulation return. She looked at both officers, her expression unreadable. The phone was still on speaker. Is she free to go? Mitchell gritted his teeth. Yes, ma'am. Good. And Sergeant? He flinched slightly. Yes? We'll be in touch. The call ended. The officers didn't say another word. They didn't need to. The damage was already done. The moment the cuffs were off, she rubbed her wrists, feeling the sting where the metal had bitten into her skin. The tension in her shoulders remained, but now it was no longer fear or uncertainty. It was controlled anger. The crowd that had gathered stood frozen, phones still recording, waiting to see what would happen next. The officers knew they were being watched. They knew this was no longer just an arrest. It was a story. She looked from one officer to the other, her expression unreadable. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. "You just take the cuffs off and walk away like nothing happened?" Sergeant Mitchell cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we were just following protocol." "You fit the description." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right? A description vague enough to justify throwing cuffs on an innocent woman without a single question." She shook her head. "Tell me something, Sergeant. If I hadn't made that call, where would I be right now?" Neither officer answered. The younger one looked down, shifting awkwardly. Mitchell, on the other hand, squared his shoulders, still trying to hold on to whatever authority he thought he had left. "You're free to go," he said simply. Her eyes narrowed. "That's not an answer." Mitchell exhaled through his nose. "We had reason to detain you." "But," he hesitated, clearly choosing his next words carefully. "Given the new information, we've determined you are not the suspect we were looking for." "New information?" she repeated, arching an eyebrow. "You mean the part where I had to call my sister? The part where you realized you weren't just arresting some random black woman, but someone with connections?" A flicker of something crossed Mitchell's face. Was it regret? Embarrassment? It didn't matter. "This was never personal," he muttered. She took a step closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. "That's the problem, Sergeant. It's never personal for you, but it's always personal for us." Mitchell didn't respond. He knew better than to argue. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice quieter, less sure. "Look, we made a mistake." She turned to him, studying his face. There was something in his eyes, not quite remorse, but the beginning of understanding. "A mistake," she repeated. "A mistake that could have cost me everything." She let the words sit in the air for a moment. "Would you have believed me if I told you my sister was the Attorney General before I made that call?" Neither of them answered. They didn't have to. She already knew. She took a deep breath and looked around at the crowd, the phone still recording. She knew this video would go viral. It would be dissected, debated, argued over. Some people would see the injustice, while others would defend the officers, claiming they were just doing their jobs. But she didn't care about that right now. She turned back to the officers. "I hope you remember this moment," she said, voice calm but firm, "because I promise you, my sister will." With that, she turned and walked away, head held high. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The damage was already done. The walk away from the police car felt heavier than it should have. Even with her freedom restored, her heart still pounded with the aftershocks of what had just happened. The air was thick with the weight of what could have been. If she hadn't made that call, if she hadn't had the right connections, she knew exactly where she would be right now. Locked in the back of that squad car, on her way to the station, trying to prove her innocence from inside a holding cell. She flexed her fingers, trying to shake off the numbness from the cuffs, but the feeling lingered. The street was quieter now, but the energy around her was anything but. The crowd still hovered, phones in hand, whispering among themselves. Some gave her nods of solidarity, others just stood there, wide-eyed, unsure of what to say. The video was already making its rounds. She had no doubt that by morning, her name, her story would be everywhere. Behind her, the officers stood stiffly, exchanging hushed words. They hadn't left yet. Maybe they were trying to figure out what to do next, how to spin this in a way that wouldn't ruin them. Maybe they were hoping she'd just walk away quietly. But she wasn't done yet. She stopped and turned around. "You think this ends here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the night. Sergeant Mitchell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The younger officer, clearly more shaken by what had just happened, shifted uncomfortably. She stepped closer, just enough for her words to land exactly where she needed them to. "You thought you had all the power a few minutes ago. Thought you could just take me in, make me disappear for a few hours, maybe longer. You didn't ask questions. You didn't listen. You saw a black woman, and that was enough." Mitchell's eyes flickered, but his face remained unreadable. We were following procedure, he muttered. She let out a sharp breath. And that's the problem. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice lower, less sure. What happens now? She studied him for a moment. He wasn't as hardened as Mitchell. Maybe he hadn't been on the force long enough to completely bury his conscience. Maybe, somewhere deep down, he realized what they had done was wrong. That's not up to me, she said simply. That's up to the people watching. She gestured toward the crowd, toward the phones still recording. She knew the video would be dissected by morning. People would analyze every second of it, break it down frame by frame. Some would call for justice. Others would make excuses for the officers. The usual cycle. But this time, there was a difference. This time, they hadn't just wrongfully arrested anyone. They had arrested the sister of the U.S. Attorney General. And that meant this wouldn't just be another forgotten case buried under a stack of similar injustices. The younger officer swallowed hard. Mitchell's face remained unreadable, but the way he clenched his fists told her everything she needed to know. She turned to leave again, but paused, looking over her shoulder one last time. Good luck, she said, her voice calm. You're going to need it. Then she walked away, not because they let her, but because she had never belonged in those cuffs to begin with. She walked away, but the weight of the night still clung to her. The adrenaline had kept her steady in the moment, but now, as she moved further from the squad car, she could feel the tremors of what had just happened settling into her bones. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the screen. It was her sister calling back. She exhaled before answering. I'm okay, she said before her sister could even speak. A sharp breath on the other end. Then, where are you? She glanced around, taking in the street she had been so abruptly detained on. Still here, just walking. There was a pause. Then her sister's voice, low and controlled, but carrying an edge that she knew meant trouble for someone. I've already made some calls. She wasn't surprised. I figured. You need to file a formal complaint, her sister said. This can't just go away. She stopped walking, looking up at the streetlights buzzing overhead. The crowd was beginning to disperse, the energy of the moment fading. But she could still feel the eyes of a few lingering bystanders on her. It's not going to go away, she murmured. Not after tonight. Her sister sighed on the other end of the line. I want their names, their badge numbers. She hesitated. She knew this wasn't just personal for her sister. It was bigger than that. A wrongful arrest of a black woman would have made the news regardless. But when that woman was the sibling of the U.S. Attorney General, that was a political firestorm waiting to happen. I have video, she said instead. So do a dozen other people. I've already seen some of it, her sister admitted. It's spreading fast. She closed her eyes for a moment, processing that. It didn't feel real yet, but she knew what was coming. News outlets would pick it up. Commentators would analyze every word, every movement. Some would call it a clear example of racial profiling and abuse of power. Others would twist it, justify it, say she should have complied faster, should have done something differently. The usual arguments. You okay? Her sister asked after a moment of silence. She exhaled, opening her eyes again. I don't know. It was the most honest answer she could give. Her sister's voice softened, but the steel beneath it remained. This isn't over. I know. And she did. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who didn't have a sister with the power to make a phone call that changed everything. Everyone who had been cuffed and thrown into the back of a police car without a second thought, but with no one on the other end of the line to save them. Her hands clenched around her phone. They'll answer for this, her sister promised. For the first time that night, she let herself believe it. She took a breath and started walking again, this time not just to leave, but toward whatever came next. The morning came faster than she expected. Sleep had been a distant thought, replaced by the constant buzzing of her phone. Messages flooded in. Friends, family, coworkers, even people she hadn't spoken to in years, all reaching out. Some were checking in, making sure she was okay. Others sent screenshots of the video, now viral, with headlines already forming around her name. She sat at her kitchen table, her untouched coffee growing cold in front of her. The weight of it all pressed down on her, heavier than the handcuffs had been. This wasn't just a bad night anymore. It was a moment, a movement, Another call from her sister. She sighed and answered. "Turn on the news," her sister said without preamble. She grabbed the remote and clicked on the TV. It took less than a second to see what her sister was talking about. There she was, frozen mid-sentence, standing in front of the two officers, her hands still cuffed. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Wrongful arrest sparks nationwide outrage." Her breath hitched. "They're already spinning it," her sister said, voice tight. "Police statements claim they were following protocol, that you fit the description of a suspect." She let out a bitter laugh. "That's the line they're going with?" "They don't have much else to work with," her sister replied. "But trust me, that's not going to be enough to save them this time." The footage looped again, her standing firm, calling her sister, the moment the officers realized their mistake. Social media had dissected every second of it. Some praised her composure. Others were furious, calling for immediate consequences. The hashtag justice for her was already trending. She rubbed her temple. "What happens now? You tell me," her sister said. "Do you want to press charges?" She hesitated. Part of her wanted to just move on, to let this storm pass and return to her life. But another part of her, one that was growing louder by the minute, knew that if she walked away now, she'd regret it. "I don't want this to just be about me," she finally said. "If I didn't have you, if I was just another black woman without connections, I'd still be sitting in a holding cell." Her sister's voice softened. "I know." She glanced at the TV again, watching as legal analysts debated the situation. Some called it a clear violation of her rights. Others tried to play devil's advocate. But none of them could deny one thing. This case wasn't going away. "I want action," she said firmly. "I want them held accountable. Not just these two officers. This whole broken system that allows this to keep happening." A small pause. Then her sister exhaled, almost like she had been waiting for those exact words. "Good," she said, "because I've already set up meetings with civil rights attorneys. We're going to fight this." For the first time since last night, a sense of clarity settled over her. This wasn't just a personal battle. It was something bigger, and she was ready. She picked up her phone and opened Twitter. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed, "I'm not just walking away. Justice for her." She hit send, and just like that, the fight officially began.